In this lecture, I'll be discussing the dynamics of population and the question of overpopulation as a whole. Some of the big questions that I like to come up with here, or have you guys think about as we go through this lecture and this section, is first, is there a population problem? And if there is a population problem, where exactly is it located? Is this a global or world problem? Is it located in so-called developed countries or so-called undeveloped or developing countries? The other question that comes to mind here is that if it is in fact a problem, then how should it be addressed? And who might be the proper actors to address the said issue of overpopulation? If we are talking about an issue of overpopulation, then what measures should potentially the state, private entities, including religious organizations or activist organizations, or internationally at the level of the UN, who should act? So in the lecture, some of the main points to go through would be discussion of early population theorists. I'll talk about the population bomb and its impacts. Really, most of the work here comes from Paul Ehrlich in 1968, although he references earlier works, and indeed it's in many ways referencing Thomas Malthus's work on his population projections. I'll talk a little bit about the demographic transition and some population estimates today, and we'll get into national policy and biopower, both in the context of China, but mostly focusing in Mexico, and finally conclude with the discussion of Manner's piece when he goes through the neo-Malthusian arguments of Paul Ehrlich and others in the population bomb, and essentially talks about the ideological and cultural underpinnings as well as the ramifications of how it should be addressed and whom should address it, and what are those implications in terms of equity overall. So we see early on theorists who are discussing natural history. And if you remember from the beginning of the semester, we talked about biological anthropology and how biological anthropologists in particular, look at what makes us similar to or different from other organisms. Early theorists in biology include José Luis Clerc, Comte de Foon, and he wrote a book on natural history in general, in particular, in 1749 to 1788, made a number of different observations. A key for our discussion here is the second one, that life multiplied faster than its food supply, and this promoted a struggle for existence. And so here the underlying model, much as in economics, is this notion of scarcity. And with this, you see extinctions occurring between species, different species with different physical variations. The population discussions begin in earnest, and really we draw from a lot of these ideas from the late 1700s. In 1798, Thomas Malthus produces his first essay on the principle of population. This becomes one of 6 or 7 versions of his book, where he continually responds to critics, to those that refute his points. And indeed, this is much a debate, discussion about whether, in fact, we are overrunning as human beings the capacity of the earth to provide for sustenance for all of us. And Malthus essentially maintained that you have population growing at what is essentially an exponential rate, and the resources, particularly food supply, are only going to grow arithmetically. And so eventually you do see under a Malthusian framework that in fact the human population will outstrip the capacity of the earth to produce food, leading to positive checks on population, including war, pestilence, and disease. From an ecological perspective, we can see many of these concepts have permeated into the debate and discussion concerning overpopulation and population of human beings as a whole. One of the key ideas here is the idea of carrying capacity. carrying capacity in a real general sense is the number of individuals in a given species that can be sustained indefinitely in a given space. And it will vary depending on the environment as a whole. And for animals such as the moose and the wolf population on Isle Royale, we see that they vary in relationship with one another depending on food supply of the moose, predator, and predator population of wolves. So they vary in unison with one another, become part of their overall environmental dynamic. When we think about any population, population growth can be measured by the number of births minus deaths plus immigration into the region as well as emigration out, or alternatively, birth rates plus immigration minus death rates plus immigration. And it's really in these discussions about carrying capacity, there have been many discussions about where we as human beings are situated in ecological context. Are we in fact more are selected towards boom and bust cycles, as would be suggested by an overshoot of carrying capacity and dieback, or are we more K-selected where we are able to live at or near equilibrium over long periods of time and not quite going to the point of overshoot and then dieback? Amongst those that drew from Thomas Malthus are Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. And it should be pointed out that Charles Darwin was really reticent to publish his information on the origin of the species by variational evolution. And one of the real pushes behind this was a close friend of his, Charles Lyell, who was a geologist, who let him know that Alfred Russel Wallace was slowly but steadily creeping along towards publishing information that Charles Darwin had collected very extensively, and Wallace was going to go to print with much less backing and scientific data. At that point, Darwin decided to throw his hat in, and they co-published on the origin of species by means of natural selection. And in this text, they talk about this idea of descent with modification and the idea of natural selection, or what is also known as variational evolution. It's based upon three principles: the idea of variation, that no two individuals are the same; the idea of heredity, where offspring will resemble their parents; and natural selection, where different variants leave different numbers of offspring. And this becomes a key concept in variational evolutions, as variants that are more successful or fitter will be able to survive to reproductive age and hence reproduce more offspring who inherit the traits that made their parents fit. And so in a Darwinian sense, when we talk about fitness, it doesn't have anything to do with necessarily anything to do with physical prowess, but just the ability to survive in a given environment. And indeed, from early in the semester, we talked a little bit about survival of the fittest. And this notion of survival of the fittest comes from Herbert Spencer and is applied in the context of social Darwinism, and is later mistakenly attributed to Charles Darwin, talking about in The Origin of the Species. One of the pieces of evidence that Darwin introduces are the finches of the Galapagos and the notion of adaptive radiation, and how these finches are uniquely situated to particular niches or spaces that they occupy within the environment. So this is essentially the sum total of where and how the organism lives, including its food resources as well as shelter requirements. And you can see that these finches are going to adapt to particular locations within the Galapagos and be able to situate themselves in relation to their food supply as well as habitat overall. Much explanation has been made about the notion of the demographic transition. And essentially we see this as a broad explanatory framework of demographers to trace the development and changes in population over time. Essentially, this argument looks at essentially a lockstep fashion of the demographic transition, which will invariably and inevitably occur, where you see high birth and high death rates early on, and then with the introduction of new tools and technologies, including biomedicine, you start to see a decline in death rate in the red there. Now, that decline in death rate is not matched initially with a decline in birth rate. Hence, you see a resultant increase in the population overall. Over time, this transitions as the birth rate begins to fall and eventually even out with birth rate and death rate in close proximity to one another over time. And we can see both population pyramids on the bottom in terms of male-female. We can see examples of expanding populations in the Amazon basin tribes, as well as populations that are potentially in decline, where you see a fairly dramatic decline in birth rates, which leads to a larger bubble of the population. And there's lots of questions in many so-called developing countries or developed countries today about an aging population. What is that going to mean for overall resources and how they're distributed by the state as a whole? As I mentioned earlier, probably one of the most influential books recently around the population debate and discussion has been Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb. And in this, he laments the loss of empty space and the terrors of physical overcrowding. And if you read the first part of his book, he situates the problem of overpopulation pretty firmly in the context of so-called less developed countries, and particularly India. He essentially notes, along with others following and in line with these ideas of that the earth is in fact overpopulated, that states that cannot produce enough food for their population are themselves overpopulated. He has these projections where in the late 1960s, with a population of about 4 billion, he estimates that there will be a decline in the population down to about 1.5 billion by 2001. This would be a desirable dieback, in essence, to get to a point where humans' population is in line with the carrying capacity of the planet as a whole. And he has very dark predictions in this first version of the book, noting in the preface, both in 1968 and then later in 1971, in the preface to the next edition, he says that the battle to feed humanity is over. In the 70s and 80s, millions will starve to death in spite of any crash program embarked upon now. And so essentially people's fate is sealed. He is essentially dooming to death over half of the population of the planet as a whole. He revises this later on in 1978 to what he calls Scenario 3, which is more benign, with the population of the globe reaching 6 billion around 2055. But at the same time, he predicts famine, food riots, as well as plague for all those who fail to align with what he refers to as the World Common Control System, which was created by the U.S. Or would be created by the United States, as well as an international survival tax at the level of the United Nations, which would allow for the transfer of goods and resources from the rich to the poor overall. So today, when we consider world population, here you can see estimates from 2011. We can see about 6.85 billion individuals in 2011, about 7.2 today, and the various population distribution across the globe. We can see, of course, very heavy concentration in Asia of population as a whole, and relatively less populated areas in the Americas as a whole, and Australia. So again, the key here in thinking about population at the level of the state, we see China and India comprising about 37% total of the global population, followed by the United States, Indonesia, Brazil, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, the Russian Federation, and Japan, with other countries comprising 41.2%.